Our speaker tonight needs little introduction to most of you, although he probably deserves a much more eloquent introduction than what you're going to hear from me. He's a noted lecturer, author, and educator on many subjects, but most importantly for us this evening, on the Constitution of the United States. He's one of the living patriarchs in the United States today in constitutional studies. Cleon Skousen was born in Canada. He came to the United States with his family at the age of 10. He also has lived in Mexico and in England. He graduated from San Bernardino College in California and then attended the George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C., where he received his Juris Doctorate degree. He has been admitted to practice in the District of Columbia and before the United States Supreme Court. Dr. Skousen and his wife Jewel are the parents of 8 children. Dr. Skousen's professional background includes 16 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, 4 years as Chief of Police in Salt Lake City, and over 10 years as a university professor. Dr. Skousen is a widely read author. Many of his books are used in colleges as textbooks, and several have been translated into foreign languages and published in other countries. His latest book, The Majesty of God's Law, was just printed and released this last spring. One of Dr. Skousen's most widely read books, The Making of America, which is subtitled The Substance and Meaning of the Constitution, is a standard for serious students of the Constitution throughout the United States. It traces nearly 300 specific principles that deal with very specific rights that were considered important by the Founding Fathers and included in the Constitution. Dr. Skousen was also the founder of the National Center for Constitutional Studies and the founder and publisher of the monthly magazine, The Constitution. Is it any wonder that Dr. Skousen would be selected to speak to a group such as this, commemorating the signing of the Constitution? Please join me in welcoming Dr. W. Cleon Skousen.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. My dear friends and fellow Americans, what an honor to be here tonight. But to be here tonight and hear about half of the making of America so dramatically and well presented, and to see the scouts here with their fine leaders, and then to see this marvelous audience, I just can't express to you the thrill of just being invited to participate. And as I listen to these fine spokesmen on behalf of the founders, it just thrilled me. And I'm inspired that Scott Bradley was kind enough to use some of the things that we had in our book, The Making of America. He just told me that just now. I just learned about it. Thomas Jefferson, as he stood up there and said those words that introduced the Declaration of Independence, took him 17 days to write the first 2 paragraphs. He came there, he already had that long list of protests against Britain. People thought that's what took so long to write it. No, he had that written. He'd written 3 constitutions for Virginia already, and each time he'd introduce all the things that the king had done that disgraced him. And so he had that. That didn't take him any time at all. He could have written that in a day. What he was trying to do in the first 2 paragraphs was to capture the 8 great eternal principles on which free governments will have to be based. First time in history. Hadn't been done in at least modern times. And so that's what you heard tonight. You heard those first two paragraphs. Beautiful. Just another comment or two here about these fine performers. John Adams. I love John Adams. He started out as an opponent of Jefferson. And as old men, they got together and they decided that they were both pretty good fellows. And all their latter days were together, and they've corresponded back and forth. They wanted to live until the 4th of July, 1826, and they were both dying. And so they just held out. In fact, they wanted to feature them at a big 4th of July celebration. They were both too sick to come. And finally, they did survive till the 4th of July. And when John Adams started to breathe toward the end, he just could say these few words, "Thank God Jefferson still lives." As he slipped across the veil, it was probably Jefferson that said, "Welcome, my old friend." He had died about 4 hours earlier. And they both died on the 4th of July. Oh, what great men. And Tom Paine, you know those words you heard tonight? Those were read to all of the troops of George Washington the night before they crossed the Delaware and won that magnificent battle at Trenton. Those men were starving. Two of them froze on the way. They had to cross the river and march nearly 16 miles and then attack. They'd been marching all night. And the mercenaries had been celebrating the holiday, and so they were kind of under the weather. And by golly, we captured 1,000 Hessian troops. It was a great victory. And Cornwallis was so angry and upset, he ordered his men to march from their headquarters, which was nearby, and they would capture Washington the next morning. When they got there, here were the bonfires on the east side of the river. They had their backs to the river. Why, he said, we'll have a good breakfast in the morning and we'll really take them. They got up in the morning and guess what? Nothing out there but ashes. It was a subterfuge. And during the night, Washington marched his men around and took the town they had just left. So it was another great victory. That's the way that thing went. It's a thrilling story. And my task tonight is to tell the other half of the story. When the Constitution was put together, the founders put 248 principles in it. As a student of the Constitution, I wish that somebody had outlined every one of those principles and then put in the words of the founders as to why it was important and why they left out some things. So it took me a number of years to lay that out. So what I did in the making of America was to go through the whole Constitution. You can't see it down there, but here's every one of the principles. Here's what it said. Here's what it meant. Here's why the founders said it was important. There are 248 principles the founding fathers put in there. Now we have 286, some great, some not so great. But I thought it would just be wonderful to be able to sit down and take it principle by principle. That's the way I would like to have studied the Constitution. Nobody had written the book. And it took me quite a long time to do it. And it came out as the making of America. It's beginning to catch on again. It did it right in the beginning. Gradually, other people say, let's just sit down and see what they really were trying to do. And they're shocked. Out of those 248 principles the founders established, many have been shattered, ignored, or overruled. Now, the other half of the story is the founders knew this was going to happen. And they knew that it would gradually unravel. And pretty soon the states' rights would be absorbed, ignored, or overruled. Instead of having a Senate made up of people who were appointed by the heads of the states to protect those rights, there would be a 1913 amendment, one shortly thereafter, that made senators not appointed by the states, but elected by the people, and that made the senators have to promise the same thing congressmen do in order to get their votes. So we've got the whole balance was broken down when that happened. So many things occurred. The money system that was set up so that you would be secure in your resources when you earned them and saved them was changed. And we no longer had money of gold and silver. And I was told in school that didn't matter. It did matter. When I was a boy, you could buy milk for 15 cents a quart and bread for 10 cents a loaf. You could get a nice new Ford car for $500, and the others came along later. A luxury car was $1,000. You could pay for a home in about 5 years. Do you know that if you stick with gold and silver, and all the studies show this, about the most the prices will raise is 2%, and then they'll drop back. The most they will drop is about 2%, then they'll drop back. Do you realize the buying power that your money has lost since we changed from gold and silver to these little pieces of paper? You can't redeem this for anything. Just get another dollar bill, that's all you can get. That's fiat money. The founder said, don't go that way. Or those of you who have saved and earned and so forth, they'll gradually take it away from you. And so all the prices have gone up, you see, about 10 times what they used to be. And say, well, our wages went up, think. Well, they did. And they'll keep going up. And then some other strange things began to happen. We reached a point back in 1936 where the Supreme Court decided it would be nice to have private welfare. The Constitution said general welfare. What did that mean? Well, it meant that all the taxes came from all the people, and Congress cannot pass any law that is for the special benefit of some group or some individual. That's private welfare. Supreme Court amended the Constitution, never went to Congress, never went voted on by the people. And do you know what happened? All the congressmen ran home and said, oh, I know so many nice private welfare projects we ought to have for our state. Do you know what the national debt was in 1936? $8 billion. By 1980, it was $800 billion. Today, it is $5 trillion. Why? The people all got entitlements. Wonderful. You just sock it to the federal government. They'll get the money somehow. They don't have the money. So what did they do? They borrowed it from the next 5 generations. Oh, the founders must have wept in the great spirit realms where they are as they watched us gradually unwind and unravel this beautiful, beautiful, inspired Constitution. I have a whole chapter in my new book about the warning that the founders knew this would happen. And they said the day will come when you'll have to do it all over again. I wrote The Majesty of God's Law at the encouragement of a wonderful friend and beloved leader who chastised the lawyers of Utah because they weren't getting ready for the crisis that was coming. See, the thing can unravel. And he said it will unravel. And you aren't getting prepared. Well, I happened to just be sitting in the room. I wasn't with them. And as soon as it was my turn to step up to where he was in his sick, he was very ill at the time, I said, before you ask me what you want me to do, can I tell you something? I'm a lawyer. I wouldn't know what to do if we had a crisis and I was asked to put it all back together again. And I wouldn't know where to go to find out. He said, well, the founders knew. I said, well, I specialize in their study. I never heard them talking about it coming down and then having to be rebuilt. Yes, they knew. Now, I'm asking you, if you can, go back to BYU. I have a special assignment for you down there. And while you're down there, look into this and see what you find. When he died about 18 months later, I had found over 1,000 letters printed and available. Nobody was looking at them, describing it coming down and describing how to build it back up and establish God's law. Now, I have to tell you very quickly this little bit so you appreciate it. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 8, it's Moses talking to the Israelites. And he said, you have just been told the program for Enoch and the great prophets of ancient times who became the richest, most powerful, most peaceful, freedom-loving people in the history of the world. You were given the formula, and you'll blow it. And you'll wander off into the wilderness. It will not be until the latter days, as Israel begins to be gathered into the new Zion, that this law will finally be practiced. The founders picked up on that. They were all students of the Bible. Latin for the Old Testament, Greek for the New, and they found Deuteronomy 1 to 8. Ooh, they said, if we could just have God's law in our time. They hated the kind of law that I had to study in school. It's called English Common Law with a lot of adaptations. I didn't like the study of that law. And when my professor of constitutional law asked me how I liked this class, I said, I don't enjoy it. Well, he said, what's wrong with it? I said, I spent 2 hours studying some ancient case, trying to learn a single principle, and it's very uneconomical. Well, he said, Harvard developed that in 1870. It's called a case study, and so everybody uses it. And I said, well, I think it's very unprofitable. He said, how would you like to be taught? I said, I'd like to be taught like George Wythe taught Jefferson. Well, how did he teach him? Taught him principles. Jefferson had over 1,000 cases, and he won most of them. Just talking principles. Well, he said, I get your point. Maybe you were ready to study the founders' writings. And he's the one that got me started. And I devoured it. It was just like drinking at a great fountain of beautiful principles of truth. That's the way I started studying it. And in spite of my aberrations, I passed the bar the first time, got through it, so forth, and then went into professional life. But I learned enough about the Constitution to know that it was being mutilated. And some parts of it were just being torn apart. Now, having gone through that exercise, that's the story of my life. Trying to learn the Constitution so we could do it again exactly the way it was done the first time. And that's how I went to the trouble of this one, getting every one of the principles and why it was important, and finding out that many of them have been shattered. Then I wrote the second book. Took 27 years to find out how to make God's law work. It's an exciting system. It's coming. We've never had it before. We've never had it before. And we aren't going to have it until there's a restoration of the Constitution, and we've gone through a cleansing. America is going to go through a cleansing, Founder said. And we'll come up on the other side, a much more humble, teachable, amenable, respectful people of this great law. Now, people don't understand how badly mutilated the Constitution is until it hits them. And they'll say, what's going on here anyway? The other day, the president let it be known that he was going to take about nearly 2 million acres of Utah and make it a nice monument to a beautiful wilderness. And Utah just rose up, and most of them, there were a few people who said that'd be just great. It happens that the largest undeveloped coal reserve in the United States is within those acres. And 200,000 of those acres are dedicated to the benefit of the schools, so that if the coal were mined, and so the schools would get nearly $1 billion out of it. So there's a lot of outraged people. Well, the newspaper came out with the question that people should have been asking. There it is, the headline. Whose land is it? Is it Utah's land or is it the federal government's land? Whose land is it? What's your answer? You'll be amazed with the answer. The Constitution tells the federal government in Article 1, Section 8, what it has the authority to do. And the 10th Amendment says they don't have anything that isn't enumerated, unless there's an amendment. And so I want to read to you what it says in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 about federal lands. Here's what the federal government can own within the boundaries of a state. It shall be only places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be for the erection. They can only buy land from the state or occupy land from the states for forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, or needful buildings such as post offices and federal courts. That's all. There is no authority here for national parks. There's no authority here for wilderness area. There is no authority here for federal parks, wildernesses. Then how did we ever get here? They don't have these things in Massachusetts. They don't have it in the Louisiana Purchase states, Nebraska. They have just this much land. It's about 1%. 1% of the land in all of the original eastern states and Louisiana Purchase states, that's about all the federal government has. Then what has it got out here? Amazing. In 1850, California was so anxious to be a state, guess what Congress said? Congress from the eastern states. We'll only make you a state if you let us keep 45% of all of the state of California. And the Californians were so excited they gave it to them. Then it occurred to the federal government that California could tax the socks off of them on their land. So they said, tell you what we'll do. If you won't ever tax our federal land, we're going to dedicate some of the land to your schools. And anything that is raised off of that land, the schools get. How did you like that? California made the trade. The western states were sunk. It's hard to believe what happened. As each of the western states tried to get to statehood and were shaken down and required to give up their land. So California in 1850 gave up 45%. Arizona in 1912 gave up 45%. Colorado in 1876 gave up 36%. Idaho in 1890 gave up 64%. Montana in 1889 gave up 30%. Nevada in 1864 gave up 87%. New Mexico, 1912, gave up 35%. Oregon in 1857 gave up 52%. Washington in 1889 gave up 30%. Utah in 1896 gave up 66%. That's all unconstitutional, every bit of it. It was done as a shakedown by the eastern states. And as I mentioned to you, Massachusetts, 1%. That's about all the founders intend they should have of federal lands within the boundaries of that state. And Nebraska, part of the Louisiana Purchase, 1%. All of a sudden, our people are shocked. See, we didn't know all this unconstitutional business was going on. What's the president doing? Taking off, 2 million acres and saying this is a monument, which means that the way they're administering it, if a boy goes in there, you can go in and hike, you have to walk and be very careful, falls off a cliff, you cannot bring motorized equipment in to rescue him. He must be packed out. See, we've already learned that. You can't take a helicopter in. You can't take an automobile or an ambulance in. It scares the turtles. And sometimes the owls. And they're more important than people, really, or just as important. This is how far this thing has gone. You say to yourself, Why haven't we risen up in indignation before? Well, we now are rising up in indignation. I don't know how it's going to turn out because they've got the land. It's their land by an agreement in 1896. But they want to dedicate it, make it dedicated land so there won't be any coal mining. They're against that kind of natural development. If we did allow the coal mine to be leased, the mine itself above ground would take 40 acres. It would include about as much territory as a golf course. All the rest would be underground. You wouldn't even see it. You wouldn't even know about it. There's some problems connected with pulling that much coal out of the ground for 40 years, transportation problems, etc. But who should decide whether we do it or don't do it? It's Utah. Under the Constitution, it's Utah. Mr. President, what do you think you're doing? See, that's what our whole delegation, Democrat and Republicans, went back to the president to protest. Tomorrow he'll make the announcement. I don't know what he'll say. But he might just arrogantly say, I'm going to do it. And there's precedent for it. I just have mentioned this to you briefly because as you get pinched by violations of the Constitution, everybody gets in an uproar. They can't do that to us. Then they do it. And then we go back to our jobs. We don't have enough people who will sit down and say, take me from the beginning. Take me through this thing. Where are we anyway? What happened to the 28 principles the founders said you have to feed to your next generation or you'll lose your freedom? What happened to those 28 principles? I put them all in the book. Oh, they're beautiful. And you know what we each say as we go through that study book? Hey, why don't we do that? Wouldn't that be great? Yes, it would. Now, one day, it will reach a point where it will unravel badly enough to enough people so we'll say, who knows what to do? Just get this straightened out. This thing is hanging by a thread. Have you ever heard that before? And they're to come to somebody who knows what to do. You don't have to have a lot of people who know what to do. In 1 Chronicles 1 and 12, verse 37, it tells about the smallest tribe in the days of David. Everybody else was panic-stricken. And this little tiny tribe had 200 men, and the scripture says, who understood the times and knew what to do. And 3 million people leaned upon them as they said, follow us, we'll show you what to do. We got to do that again. We've got to get our people standing up like these wonderful spokesmen did here tonight and saying, this is precious, this is important, I am going to study it. And it took me, after I realized that we had to have a primer on which way to go that would supplement this book, it took me 27 years to see how God's law works. I only have about 3 or 4 more minutes, so let me summarize very quickly. After the cleansing of America, it's coming. You're going to see it come. I wanted the book, The Majesty of God's Law, to give people hope. That down there, after the trial and tribulation, founders had it, we're going to get it. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and we're going to know what to do. For example, we're going to have a completely new system of law. God's law is beautiful. It's very simple. You don't have very many laws. You don't have to have a whole wall of laws. It's less than 100 statutes. The people are all organized into small, manageable groups, just like the Anglo-Saxons copied from Moses. You all belong to a little group of 100 people. Anglo-Saxons called it a ward, not a church ward. It's a secular ward. People of all faiths who love God, obeying His commandments, and they elect a leader for every 10 families, and 5 of those elect a leader for 50 families. 2 of those groups of 50 elect a leader for the whole 100. And I want to tell you, a youngster that goes out and puts graffiti all over the new church or something, he has a judge that was elected for 10 families, and he's one of those families. Oh, something happens to him. And the law requires reparation for all wrongs done. Isn't that interesting? You don't pay a fine to the court. You have what my law professors called a ridiculous principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You know what my professor said? Look how wrong this is. So you're fighting a fellow and he's about to get you down. So you give him the old karate poke, and out goes one of his eyes. And people saw you do it, so you get caught. And they say, now, Dr. Skousen, you put his eye out, didn't you? Yeah, but he was getting the best of me. And I was just mad, and I poked it out. My professor said, isn't that stupid? So they throw you down, poke your eye out, and they got 2 half-blind men wandering around camp. That's not what happened at all. You know what they do? They say, Dr. Skousen, which is your best eye? The right one, corrected of 2020. How much is it worth? Oh, a lot. Put a price on it. $10,000? They turn to my victim and say, is that going to be enough? No, I'm an accountant. See, the fellow Israelite. I'm an accountant. No, I wouldn't talk about anything less than $50,000. Well, the judges know I'm not going to be able to produce $50,000, but I could earn some. So we negotiate, and pretty soon we get it down, let's say $17,000. And they say, now, Dr. Skousen, you will pay him $17,000. I guess so. And they turn to him and say, and you will accept that for this unfortunate thing that happened. He's apologized now, he's sorry, and he's going to pay you $17,000. That will be agreeable with you? I guess so. So everybody gets up and walks out. And as I'm putting my papers together, one of the judges says, Dr. Skousen. He points down to the lancing needle and the hot iron and says, keep up your payments. Isn't that a great system? I want to tell you that's motivational. And notice nothing went to the court. It's his religious responsibility as an elected judge to see that justice is done and there is reparation for torts and crimes. You don't throw a rock through a jewelry store and grab a bunch of stuff and run and think you're going to get away with it. You better give back all the jewels that you still have, because you're going to have to pay for the window besides. See how that thing went? Reparation, reparation, reparation. There's justice. Wouldn't you agree? And you can wipe out graffiti right fast. And you can wipe out drive-by shooting real fast. And guess who's responsible for the investigation under God's law? The judges. And of course, if you want a jury trial and don't trust the judge, you can ask for it. You'd get it under the Constitution. And, it's a great system of law. And after about 27 years of ironing out some of the problems even the founders hadn't found, we were able to publish The Majesty of God's Law. Now I want to just say one final thing. Did you notice tonight that Benjamin Franklin pleaded for prayer? Benjamin Franklin had learned something that all of you have gone through but may not have recognized it. When I was a young college student, I was in debating. I would get problems. How can I answer that? Is there an answer to that? And I'd cogitate and I'd go to sleep worrying and sweating over it. During the night, I got it. And I woke up in the morning, oh, good old noggin, you were working on that all night. You got it. That will be a good way to handle it. Took me a long time to realize that wasn't my noggin. I hadn't researched that. It was given to me. It's called pure intelligence. It happens to be an enlightenment that every human being is born with if they'll learn to use it. Franklin had learned that when he reached impossible problems, very often in the night, he got the answers. And when I finally realized that that was one of the wonderful gifts of the light of intelligence that is in every human being, I get up and write it down, and I get on my knees and thank Heavenly Father for talking to me. Now, if you've never used this, Franklin had. And he'd come up with marvelous answers that were pure inspiration from outside of himself. And he wanted that group didn't know what to do. They were absolutely stymied when he gave that speech. They were dead in their tracks. And he said, I don't know the answers either, but let's pray, because it can come. We can get it. That's pure intelligence. It's beautiful. And I found in writing The Majesty of God's Law, I came up against the wall a number of times. I got help. That was my procedure. When I got it, I wrote it down, and then I got on my knees and said, I couldn't figure it out, Heavenly Father. Thank you for talking to me. If you've never done this, you ought to get used to leaning on that wonderful spirit of enlightenment with which every human being is endowed, the Scripture says. So gradually we solve these problems, we put them together, and guess what we end up with? A whole new system of law, a completely new system of community life. Wouldn't you agree that having a judge for every 10 families is a pretty good community system of accountability, responsibility? We'll go back to what the founders called poor people's money. And guess what it is? Gold and silver. Why is it poor people's money? Because there are no financiers and bankers to manipulate it and reduce its buying power. It's good for poor people to be able to keep the money they have earned and not have it manipulated away. There will be a new system of government from top to bottom, copied after what? The original Constitution, which provided there would be no political parties, no political campaigns, and no political slush funds for the winner. Well, how would you elect leaders? Beautiful, easy. You know who I'd vote for? Somebody that I trust to interview all the candidates. And after he's talked to all of them, he does the voting. And hopefully he wants to well represent me and all of us who know him and who trust him. Do you know what that's called? An electoral college. What do our people know about an electoral college? You know what happens? You can get a transfer of power from one administration to the next with the best available talent in the country being drafted to serve. They want to be president? That's one man we don't want. When they first set up the Electoral College, they asked each state to recommend their best man. Naturally, Virginia wanted to get Washington. And when Madison went to see him, he said, no, I have retired. 40 years is enough from serving my country. Now I want to just be a quiet farmer. Madison said, would you do it as a matter of civic duty? Washington said, don't say that. He said, I am saying it. Would you do it as a matter of civic duty? I guess so. So Virginia put up the name of George Washington. Guess who won? Could have been several. There were several others voted on, but as for president, Washington was unanimously elected. What did you get? The best man in the United States for the job of president. That's who you got. You didn't get some ambitious political individual. I was taught in school that the two-party system is the most wonderful system. Well, it's better than a three-party system or a five-party system, but not much. You got people running for office, very often unemployed. Or you have them hungry for power. And sometimes you have decent, wonderful people. I think our Utah delegation has been remarkably dedicated and committed. Doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans, and they serve the people. How would you like to have a system where the best people are voted into power by people who investigate them and in their judgment, and I always will vote for somebody in the Electoral College I trust. I might come up with a man I never heard of before. There was a guy way up, Massachusetts, and as they went around, there. He had to be drafted to represent his state, but he said he will serve if they elect him. Oh, he's great. The experience, he said, see how that goes? The founder said, that's the way you get the best people. Does this sound familiar to you at all? This is right out of the first chapter of Deuteronomy. Have a council of wise men do the nominating, who do the investigating. Then we get to vote on them ourselves. But anyway, what a great system. We'd only lasted for about 2 elections, and then the party system got in, and we've had the party system of all of the inefficient, unproductive, non-quality candidates that come up through that system. I've lived through nearly, 83 years watching it work, watching it not work. Someday we'll go back to God's law. There are no political parties, and there are no political plush funds that you can take advantage of. So the original Constitution will be restored. Leaders will be selected without involving politics. There will be an amazing, efficient system of justice. How do you like that? Reparation. No money going to the court or the government. It goes to the victim. And there will be a remarkable new spirit of cooperation and tolerance among the people of various faiths. The founding fathers called that quality of virtue. Wanting to serve, being good friends, and a great pioneer leader of Utah saw a vision of it, and he said, you'll be amazed. You're going to go up to a person of a different faith, put your arm around his shoulders, and say, brother, I think you do a good job serving I'm going to vote for you. He said, you're going to see a whole new spirit as soon as the kingdom of God is set up. And it will not only include members of, this is this man speaking, my faith, it will include good people of all faiths. That's the future. Now, I wanted to tell you this tonight so that you wouldn't think that this is a legitimate operation of government. Absolutely illegal from the founding fathers' standpoint. No authority whatsoever. I would argue it in a court. I don't think I'd get anywhere. Most judges have been trained to believe that these aberrations are necessary. Not all, thank goodness. And I wanted you, as you see this thing get a little more complicated, it will get worse before it gets better. I want you to hear men like you heard tonight who believe that, who will speak for it, who will stand for it, who would die for it. We need a generation of those people who are well-informed and committed. So that's really what the motivation was behind these books. Somebody said, well, Dr. Skousen, you have 37 books, you must make a lot of money. I give away all the royalties in my books before they're ever published. I'm not out there to print books to make money. I'm out there as a teacher trying to share with people what this wise, good man told me to do before he died. Didn't tell me what I would find. He just said, look, the founders knew the answer. So may I close with a little prayer. I love this country. I wasn't born here. I was born in Canada. And when I became an FBI agent, they said, well, you have dual citizenship. Are you a Canadian or an American? Well, I said, I guess I'm an American. And I have to be an American to be an FBI agent. Yes, you do. And you got to choose. And after I chose, guess what happened? The Canadians decided to write a new constitution. And because I had been a Canadian, I got a chance to go up there and work with a member of Parliament. And we wrote a constitution for Canada. It's never been adopted, but it was so fun to write it. But they've got it. Someday they may want to use it. And so it's been an advantage to be both. But I pray God's blessing on you. I congratulate Scott in writing up this marvelous presentation tonight. This just thrilled me. This is the way John Adams hoped we'd celebrate not only the 4th of July, but Constitution Day. You're one of the very few groups of people in the whole United States celebrating Constitution Day. I bless you for it. I pray God's blessings upon you. And thank you for giving me the privilege of being with you tonight. Thank you.